If you know me, you know that one of my all-time favorites in terms of television shows is Mike Judge's King of the Hill. But in a media marketplace that's increasingly saturated by adult animation that runs the gamut from psychologically introspective to downright surreal, it's kind of a wonder how this humble show about a propane salesman in Texas has been so successful. Well over a decade after its finale, this cartoon is responsible for, among other things, an active internet fan community, dozens and dozens of beloved memes and quotes, and plenty of homages in its cartoon colleagues. So the question remains, why exactly? What? Good news, don't worry, I'm here to help. The show's been around for a long time, so naturally I'm far from the first person to tackle its unique flavor of appeal. Podcasts, think pieces, other video essays, there's a wealth of content, which means there's no real need for me to say my piece. But I'm gonna do it anyway. There's a lot to say here, so for the sake of clarity, I'm gonna break down each element into an individual part, adding up to the big, glorious, clean-burning whole. Okay. Put on your cowboy hats and fire up your propane tanks. Here we go. Of the many adult animated shows that have cruised through the Fox Sunday night block, coming and going with varying levels of success, King of the Hill somehow still stands without much to compare to in terms of its exact style. I've seen it likened to Bob's Burgers, but even that feels kind of different at the core. This show is a true original. But why? I tend to describe this show's defining trait in that there is, no reason for it to be animated. It's theoretically normal people doing things that normal people could theoretically do. The characters don't push the boundaries of the medium in the way that, say, Rick Sanchez or even Peter Griffin might. There's no reality rule bending for the sake of gags, no fantastical elements. The closest we get is the occasional weird, varnish-induced whack-a-mole dream.
I'm wearing diapers, Father.
What?
But at its core, this is just Texas, guys. In effect, it's a standard sitcom, just expertly drawn by a team of animators, following a guide that tells you, no! You do not make Peggy sexy, ever! Stupid! This isn't some sheer coincidence. The show's whole setting hinges on the mundane. King of the Hill seeks to take relatively simple situations and make them both engaging and funny. The aptly titled regular show has a similar angle for getting its story going, but it's famous for spitting out into completely outrageous fantasy and sci-fi almost every time. King of the Hill's different. It boldly chooses to make you interested in stuff that never goes beyond our world. Yeah, it does kind of toe the line of what mundane actually is. Take, for example, a somewhat controversial episode about Luann getting a new job that spins wildly out into a storyline about a pork magnate with sick trauma-induced fantasies who later gets dressed up like a pig and accidentally ground up into sausage. But that level of absurdity isn't the usual order of the day. A more typical plot is something like Hank being a shop teacher, or Bobby being stressed when his best friend goes through puberty. It always knows how to be just strange enough. Instead of pulling its weirdness from genre fiction tropes, it invites us to see weirdness in our everyday lives. It's also great at creating situations that are simultaneously totally banal and meaningless, and then making them into these huge high-stakes conflicts. Take one of my favorite episodes, Peggy's Fanfare. This episode has the Hill family and their church congregation going to a country music festival. Normal stuff. Well, somewhere along the line, country music superstar Randy Travis plagiarizes a song that Peggy wrote about growing up with huge feet, and he successfully gaslights her over it. I won't detail the whole episode, just know it involves childhood bullying, Kix Brooks eating horse crap, and a trailer being sunk in a lake. It's totally absurd, but it's also plausible in everyday reality. That could happen. and moreover, it's just a beautiful little piece of television. The show works within the boundaries of our world to reveal just how outrageous it can be without a single space alien or cutaway gag. Element 2, the characters. The team behind King of the Hill understands a vital part of what makes a good show, and it's that a strong character trumps every other element in the setup. You can have the most brilliant setting in the world when making your show, but crappy characters will ruin the whole deal. I've had animation professionals advise me on this in the past. You get characters who are watchable in any setting, and then you put them to work. That's how you make a good show. And King of the Hill does this with expert precision, taking the everyday setting we just discussed and filling it with deceptively everyday people whose quirks can easily create a ton of situations that can entertain you for hundreds of episodes. Every character in the show is full of development that makes plotting out a fun story pretty easy. And I mean every character. Everyone from Hank himself to his beer-drinking alley friends to his stepfather has some sort of backstory, and they provide explanations for why they're the way they are, and set up hilarious, really clever plot lines. This is maybe shown most clearly in Hank himself. A lot of the show's conflict comes back to his characterization, which is a polite but somewhat awkward working-class conservative in Texas. This short description, while correct, doesn't really do justice to the amount of debt that Hank contains. He's a traditional Texas Republican, but his sense of decency means he would never espouse outright bigotry, even in the face of things that make him uncomfortable. He's usually a stickler for people behaving in ways that he deems normal, but his obsession with something as random and specific as propane is almost like a neurodivergent hyperfixation. He's a victim of an abusive parent who, intentionally or not, tries to break the cycle. He loves his dog to a hilarious extent. He takes some little things way too seriously, and some very serious things a little too lightly. I could go on. He is layers upon layers of character, a veritable tiramisu of a man. At the same time, an archetype and a deviation. And in that way, he's really human. And part of what makes it all work is that almost every character on the show is just the same. Dale is primarily characterized as a conspiracy theorist, but he's also a doting father and a husband. And he doesn't mind his dad being gay. Bill is an extremely divorced, sad sack loser, but he's also a skilled chef with a lot of love to give. It's a cartoon. Yeah, and caricatures and shorthand exist. But that's not all there is. And maybe most importantly, the characters play off each other super well. With that many strong personalities and a ton of little quirks, you're bound to get some golden interactions out of putting them together in a scene and just playing around. For example, putting Hank's straight-laced, often naive patriotism up against Dale's implicit distrust of anything governmental. Peggy's huge ego and micromanaging attitude confronted with Luann's laid-back, youthful perspective. And maybe used by the writers more than anything else, Hank's traditionalist American masculine ideals and rigid sense of social structure, clashing with Bobby's goofy, open-minded creative spirit. A pretty great example of how this show's sense of tone and setting links up with its equally strong sense of character is in the episode Yankee Hanky. Hank finds out he was actually born in New York City, and he is, as a proud Texan who resents coastal city lifestyles, utterly inconsolable and outraged. He's genuinely incensed by this and even mentions that it was difficult for him to marry Peggy as she was born in Montana. This is funny enough. But where's the actual action? Well, it turns out he wasn't just born in the Big Apple, he was born in Yankee Stadium, because his surly, jingoistic World War II vet father dragged his pregnant mother in there in an attempt to assassinate Fidel Castro. This plot thread sees Hank's father Cotton and a bunch of his friends attempting to make good on their failed attempt on Castro's life, dragging Hank along with him. While their plan naturally fails, Hank finds out along the way that one of the fighters at the Alamo was in fact from New York, which puts his restless Texan soul at ease. You see that? Look how much material they managed to pull out of some slightly weird dude's life in Arlen. And almost every episode is like this. I could go on about the one where Bobby gets rejected by a vegetarian girl, and the climactic scene involves him eating a 72-ounce steak in front of her. The episode where Peggy laces Hank's food with testosterone, and he gets so swole that he tries to race bulls. The one where Bobby eats sugary cereal, gets misdiagnosed with ADHD in his sugar rush, leading to Peggy quitting her job to be a stay-at-home mom and getting so cooped up and frustrated that she learns to play guitar and writes a rebellious folk song about a turtle. But I won't. You can just watch him. It's on Hulu right now. I think it's on Hulu. Is Hulu still around? Okay, stay with me. Hold on. Don't take that literally. This isn't a bait and switch atheism lecture. Or is it? Anyway, my actual point is this. No one character in King of the Hill is always right all the time. Like we've established, this is a show with a huge cast, where the characters have wildly contrasting viewpoints at both the micro and macro level. As a result of that, they obviously tend to butt heads a lot over many, many different sorts of things, be they politics, sports, neighborhood squabbles. This is about to get very long-winded, so be strong. We can do this. We're in this together. Don't you go on me. And then you add Kurt Angle to the mix. I would argue that a lot of shows have a sort of perspective character. This is the character who most often sees sense, so to speak. This isn't the same as a protagonist, because some protagonists are often framed as wrong by the show, or incompetent, or what have you. This is a character who is usually the moral compass. These characters typically exist in sitcoms or children's shows with less nuance and lower stakes. The one who is primarily positioned to combat whatever nonsense the plot of the day might throw at them, and are usually advocating for what the show intends to portray as right. A more nuanced example is a show like Rick and Morty, where ostensibly brilliant main character Rick is portrayed as being in total disarray, resistant to help from people who know better than him in certain areas. Think characters like Walter White, characters whose moral compasses are so skewed that much of their behavior is objectively bad, but their position within the story and misinterpretation of framing can often result in audiences seeing them less like these nuanced takes and more like the simple protagonist to root for that I just described. People are walking contradictions. What is a man but a miserable pile of contradictions? That's what he says in the game. And remember, King of the Hill is a show about people who could be real. A criticism often brought up when it comes to this particular structure is that these characters in question can easily become kind of smug and annoying, especially when the topics are more contentious. Family Guy has attracted some criticism, often laid to Brian. He's frequently portrayed as intelligent, more so than most people in the cast, and his tendency to be the logical centerpiece of the storylines has proven tiring in the show's long haul. Even the show itself became aware of it after a while and started to knock Brian down a peg or two. We also see this criticism levied against the modern version of The Simpsons, where Lisa's previously even-handed wit has become a little overwhelming and pompous to some viewers. Now, you might be asking, where are you going with this? I thought we were talking about King of the Hill. My argument is this. King of the Hill manages to pull from both of these tones and make something in the middle, putting it to work with an ensemble cast. As a result, we get a huge world with many problems where no one person is ever right all the time. In King of the Hill, this logical centerpiece we discussed earlier is almost certainly Hank. He's our protagonist, our everyman. But this interpretation, while technically accurate, doesn't quite tell the whole story. I would argue that, unlike a lot of shows, King of the Hill makes room for every character to be sympathetic, to have their day in the sun, and to find their way into that centerpiece role. I think this goes hand in hand with the strong sense of character we discussed earlier. This simply cannot happen in a show where the characters are not fleshed out. But thankfully, King of the Hill is not that kind of show. Let's look at some examples. I like to look at Nancy Gribble first and foremost. For those not in the know, Nancy is the wife of Hank's alley friend, Dale. While Dale is a gangly, paranoid conspiracy theorist, Nancy is your typical big-haired Texan beauty queen. They have a child together, Joseph. But as you can probably tell by looking at him, Joseph is in fact not Dale's child, but the product of an affair with the local New Age healer, John Redcorn. They are actively continuing their affair during the series under the pretense of John Redcorn treating her chronic migraines. with Dale supposedly totally unaware and everyone keeping it from him. On nearly any other show, a character like Nancy Gribble might be a two-dimensional punching bag, an easy villainess. She mistreats her weird but ultimately harmless husband and doesn't seem to feel bad enough about it to stop anytime soon. But here's the funny thing, the show doesn't just make her a bad guy. She's not a good guy either. She's just a flawed person living her life. And sometimes we feel for her, and sometimes we don't. There's an entire episode devoted to her called Hair Today, Gone Tomorrow. It focuses on Nancy's life after deciding to end her affair and treat Dale better. When her treasured hair begins to fall out, she learns from her mother that this is an inherited kind of thing, and the only way to restore it to normal is to go back to John Redcorn. It's a long story, I don't want to keep you here all day, just watch the episode, it's a good episode. In the end, Nancy's better angels win out, and she stays by Dale, even if it means losing something important to her. Her hair. Something she perceives essential to her beauty, her identity. But the episode notably does not make her seem like the absolute scum of the earth for being tempted by her old ways. For this episode, she's our protagonist, our story centerpiece. Even if we don't necessarily like everything that she does, we're supposed to see the pathos here, to understand why she might consider cheating on Dale again, even if we think, and she thinks, it's a bad thing to do. This accomplishes a lot of things. It plays with moral ambiguity, it tests our perspective as viewers, and it asks us to sympathize with a person that's kind of unsympathetic. And this is hardly the only example. Peggy is a deeply contentious character. Not to me though. Stan Peggy. Oh yeah! Her ego, abrasiveness, and self-importance, among other things, are all character-defining traits that can easily grate on people's nerves. This does not, however, stop the show from making her the hero many, many times. King of the Hill benefits from having a soul. Lots of sitcoms, good and bad, pride themselves on being able to wring out an emotional scene or 2 or 10. It's a little less common in the adult animation landscape, where it kind of feels like shows have to compensate for being cartoons by piling on the cynicism and violence and general grossness. But sentimentality does exist there too. And it's absolutely key to functioning for King of the Hill in particular. This isn't just standard sitcom schmaltz, though. King of the Hill's sense of heart is unique in its ability to never stray far from its style to make an emotional point. It'll sprinkle in these sincere, sweet moments with just enough humor to retain its tone as a show, and also not spoil the moment with any bitterness or eye-rolling. One of my favorite scenes in the entire series comes from a bit of a lesser-known episode. It's actually about a lesser-known character, Hank's mom, Tilly. The episode is called Escape from Party Island. It revolves around Hank, driving Tilly and her other old lady friends, voiced hilariously by the likes of Betty White and Phyllis Diller, to the vacation destination of Port Aransas. Their goal is to visit a museum of cutesy miniatures, a shared obsession of theirs. Hank, oddball in denial that he is, finds this particular obsession embarrassing and weird and definitely not worth his time. He remembers early on how, when he was growing up, his mother would often obsess over her miniatures in a sort of creepy fantasy world, while his father's reign of terror kept everyone on edge. The meat of the episode concerns a clash between the trip and MTV's Spring Break Party, which is happening on the same island in a plot that's vaguely reminiscent of the Simpsons episode Kill the Alligator and Run, which would ironically air about a year later. But that's not why I love this. No, it comes down to one particular plot point. Towards the end of the episode, Tilly risks the group's ferry home when she realizes she's misplaced a miniature unicorn that she bought. Hank, who's more frustrated than ever by her fixation, takes off after her and ends up at the museum. He meets the man who makes the little statues, and this exchange occurs.
Was she here?
She left a few minutes ago, one unicorn richer.
Damn those stupid miniatures. They're gonna get her killed.
You don't know anything.
What?
Miniatures probably saved your mother's life.
What's that supposed to mean?
Do you know how hard it is to be a woman in this world? I do. Women come in here all the time, and they are sad, and they are lonely, and they are frumpy, and they tell me how my tiny, individually handcrafted investment-grade art is the only thing keeping them sane. Do you understand? Does that sound like your mother?
No. Well, maybe when her marriage to my dad was breaking up, but... So this little glass crap really helped her out, huh? Huh.
After this conversation, Hank purchases a miniature for his mother as a sort of apology, and she thinks it's absolutely darling. A lot is happening here, and a lot of it reveals the secret sauce of the show. First of all, it harkens back to my previous point. Hank, though we have established that he's often portrayed with arguably the strongest sense of the show's perspective, is in the wrong. He's taught a lesson by a character who is both correct and a smug jackass who says funny things, because the show doesn't sacrifice its humor to make you feel something or make a point. It speaks to something serious and dark that many sitcoms wouldn't dare to touch on, the deep, isolating burden of being a woman in a man's world. Particularly in Tilly's case, as she suffered under an abusive spouse. And in the end, we see Tilly baby talking to a miniature airport inside of a nut in a way that's both heartwarming and hilarious. The balance is impeccable. The background info on the show makes this particular aspect interesting to me. King of the Hill was created by two people, Greg Daniels and Mike Judge, though the show is often, incorrectly, solely attributed to Judge, who also plays Hank in Boomhauer. His resume is where this sense of tone gets a little interesting. Well, what do I mean by that? What is arguably his other most famous contribution to television? Well, Beavis and Butthead, of course. Now, this might not feel like a big leap on the surface. They're both beloved adult animated shows. Hank even sort of came into the world on Beavis and Butthead as the astoundingly similar character Tom Anderson. Just listen to the voice Judge uses.
Come on, let's get to pruning.
But Beavis and Butthead really is a totally different show. While neither of these are for children, King of the Hill is decidedly more adult, while Beavis and Butthead is aimed at teenagers. This goes into my next big divergence, though. Beavis and Butthead caters to teens, but a very specific kind of teen. It was a show of its time. This meant that it was specifically catering to the unique variety of mid to late 90s disaffected youth. The type of kid who would gladly spend their days in full couch potato mode, mainlining music videos to stimulate their brain in between 8-hour school sessions and, I don't know, like, the colored ketchup? There was a lot of teen-focused media at the time. Daria, a spin-off of Beavis and Butthead that wasn't run by Judge, took aim at this demographic with its sardonic but witty protagonist. It also, however, had a more robust, emotionally deep worldview. Beavis and Butthead, on the other hand, presented itself as a lowest common denominator bit of entertainment, and it did so with pride. It was made for kids who thought everything around them was like a drag, and the most pressing concern was just keeping yourself entertained. In this sense, Beavis and Butthead is a deeply cynical show. You won't be finding any of those heartwarming, emotionally wrought moments that King of the Hill knew how to delicately sprinkle in. This isn't to say Beavis and Butthead was bad, it's just a different show with different goals. Emotional depth would just look weird on it, to be honest. But Judge's peculiar track record goes beyond this one show. Let's look at one of his other big media achievements, Idiocracy. You may know this as the movie everyone references when something incomprehensibly, frustratingly insipid happens. Idiocracy is a satirical comedy film. Specifically, it's a satire of the American cultural and political landscape. If you look at the broader portfolio of Judge's work, you'll see this lens time and time again. But we'll get to that in a bit. Idiocracy is a time travel story. It's about a couple of people who end up in the future, only to discover that the American world has become critically vapid and proudly ignorant. Hence the title. It's a lot less subtle than King of the Hill. It's also a lot less kind. In its quest to poke fun at the various sicknesses of modern American culture, namely things like anti-intellectualism or laziness, there's no room for sentimentality. This isn't necessarily a problem. Most satire benefits from being totally biting. And this tone just kind of runs through Mike Judge's entire oeuvre. You see it in Office Space, a somewhat iconic pastiche of work culture. It shows up again in The Good Family, a short-lived follow-up to his King of the Hill success that takes aim at soft-hearted liberal stereotypes. This bitterness has a spectrum of success. Office Space and Idiocracy are heavily quoted and beloved by many. The Good Family, not so much, but we'll get to that a little bit later. But the cynicism. It works for a lot of Judge's shows. There's nothing inherently wrong with being bitter so long as the writing is good and the jokes are funny. I'm not convinced that a Beavis and Butthead level of aloofness towards the world would work for King of the Hill, which is why its sense of heart is so vital. Because honestly, when that key element is missing, it just isn't as good. Sometimes it doesn't even feel like the same show. One of my least favorite episodes exemplifies this. It's called Junkie Business, and it's from season 2, when it was still getting its bearings and finding its real voice. And it shows here a lot. So what exactly is the problem here? This episode revolves around Hank trying to hire a new employee at Strickland. He's, curiously immoral about it, trying to work around anti-discrimination measures in ways that are funny, but a little weird when juxtaposed with Hank's typical play-by-the-rules characteristics that viewers associate with him. Let's consult the tape.
If you could eat at Luli's with one of the following, would it be A, Jesus, B, Muhammad, C, Golda Meir?
Yeah, that's Hank engaging a little bit of a good-natured religious employment discrimination, but that's not really where the issue is here. That comes with the core of the episode, where Hank hires a guy named Leon over a super qualified woman because she lacks adequate football knowledge. This is a great example of Hank's characteristics creating those bizarre conflicts I mentioned earlier. So what went wrong? Well, it turns out Leon is actually living with a substance use disorder and is seemingly still using. This obviously increasingly impacts his work over the course of the episode. Now, this isn't really the issue here. That comes later on. Hank tries to fire Leon, who argues that he can't be kicked out because his disorder is a disability. Which, I mean, it is. The rest of the episode revolves around Leon abusing the system to avoid accountability for his actions, with the rest of Strickland also claiming disability, making up disabilities in the process to do the same, with the implication being that people do this all the time in the real world. Hank uses a loophole to get back at them, Leon is fired, and the plot resolved. So, why doesn't this work? Well, first of all, it's not even accurate. The Americans with Disabilities Act only covers substance use disorders in the workplace if the person in question is in recovery and not actively using, which Leon is. This point probably seems pedantic, but for all the silly jokes, I would definitely call King of the Hill a smart show, and as such, it seems weird for it to satirize something with a glaring inaccuracy in the middle of it. But to my main point, it's just so mean. It's picking on, disabled people in the workplace. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, getting the kind of disability accommodations in the workplace that are discussed in this episode can be both very difficult and, at least in America, kind of embarrassing, depending on the environment you're working in. While the show can be very biting and sharp, it also rarely comes off as any kind of bullying. Like most good satires, it gives its fiercest mockery to actually powerful and harmful things. And this just feels like punching down. While giving every episode a bunch of kind-heartedness would probably get saccharine, I feel like there's also a point where it gets a little too bitter, too. And this episode's a pretty good example of that. Thankfully, this episode definitely feels like an outlier, too, which kind of speaks to my greater point. I can't say for sure, but like the clunkier early episodes of Bob's Burgers, I can't really see this plotline playing out in the show's prime a couple seasons later. But I'm obviously a little biased here. Let's talk about another episode that misses the mark, that aired much later in a slightly different way. Hank's bully is a fan, unfavorite, let's say. That's a word. I don't think I've ever met anyone who likes it, even if it is kind of quotable.
Dusty old bones full of green dust. Dusty old bones
the whole entire
full of
time is
green
why
dust.
is she green?
If you're not familiar, it's one of the show's most famous duds. So what's it about? Well, title. Some snot-nosed kid bullies Hank because his parents are bleeding heart libs who hate discipline. The kid gets punished in the end, but the road to getting there is not considered worth its story journey by most fans. So what do these two episodes, airing many, many years and seasons apart, have in common that puts them in their flop era? In my opinion, balance. In a sort of negative space theory applied to television, King of the Hill succeeds in both what it does and does not include. If the show was too soft, it'd be schmaltzy. If it was too cynical all the time, it'd be tiring. But it walks the line carefully and expertly more often than it doesn't. And that's why it's so great. Now, I cannot prove this, but I think it's worth mentioning that co-creator Greg Daniels has a resume that one might expect for this sort of thing. Daniels signed on to King of the Hill after working on The Simpsons. On The Simpsons, some of Daniels' episodes include Lisa's Wedding and Secrets of a Successful Marriage, both episodes with a strong sense of heart. Daniels is also responsible for the American adaptation of The Office, another show that is both very funny and has a lot of heartwarming scenes to go by. Daniels would go on to co-create Parks and Recreation, a show that many consider funny, but also a bit schmaltzy. But that's just a theory. In adult animation theory, everyone's done that joke. Remember how I mentioned the Goode family earlier? Remember the Goode family, like, in general? Probably not. It was one of those Fox animated shows I mentioned earlier that didn't last long or really get remembered. Some people might be inclined to call it King of the Hill, but liberal. And some people have. But I think that's a little reductive to King of the Hill. Art may be subjective, but most people, of all ideological stripes, tend to agree that this show was simply just not good. Or at least not as good as Judge's other shows. But why? Time to take another brief detour. You keeping up with me? We still up? The Goode Family is an animated sitcom about a bunch of stereotypical bleeding heart liberals, primarily married couple Gerald and Helen, their biological daughter Bliss, and their South African adopted son, Ubuntu. The humor is rooted in them trying to navigate the world as those comically sensitive libs, over and over.
It stinks!
That's the extent of its humor. The stereotypical part is, in my opinion, one of the show's key failings. It's just one of many things the show fails at, though. Basically, every place where King of the Hill succeeds, this show fails. And I mean all of it. It's the whole thing. The cornerstone is perhaps the total lack of layers or three-dimensionality in the cast. They don't exist to be characters, but instead just cardboard cutouts and stereotypes. Is this good for jokes? Maybe. Not really? But even if it was, it's terrible for the long-term success if you want to make a good show. A simple bit can only go so far, at least in this context. It feels weird being like, oh, this show was flat, because you could probably say the same thing about Beavis and Butthead, which is hilarious and still holds up 9 times out of 10. But context matters here. Beavis and Butthead is a silly cartoon for teenagers, meaning it's still basically a cartoon for kids, and a very specific kind of kid, a doofy slacker. The Goode Family has a unique problem. It's a family sitcom, if not one with a little extra bite going on, not entirely unlike King of the Hill. But where one soars, this one flops. As we've established, King of the Hill understands something important for a good show: character. Yeah, the jokes in King of the Hill are funny. Yes, there are a lot of quotable lines, but the key component here is that, as we've established, the characters are strong and fleshed out, and so is the world they live in. The Goode Family is in the exact opposite direction, trying to wring humor out of a show where the setting and characters are entirely one-dimensional and just kind of walk into the same joke over and over and over again. Let me put it this way: if every single King of the Hill episode revolved just around the most base characteristics of the show, say Hank being a conservative stick in the mud and refused to budge, the show just wouldn't be as good. And so goes another key component that we've established: the depth and rotation of the show's perspectives. The show is not just about Hank being right or wrong all the time, or any character being right or wrong all the time. And frankly, the Goode Family fails in perhaps the most important distinction of all. The characters just aren't likable. Yeah, the characters in King of the Hill are weird and sometimes mean and sometimes totally off-putting, but at the end of the day, you enjoy seeing them and feel attached to them. The Goode Family doesn't bother trying to endear you to these people. We're not supposed to like them. Most of the show's best episodes exemplify this. The episode, Oh Yeah, revolves around Peggy befriending a sex worker while unaware of her profession. And while she and Hank are scandalized when they put two and two together, they also come to her aid when her pimp endangers her in an episode that is hilarious, heartfelt, and even a little subversive in its politics. In the aforementioned steak eating episode, Bobby gets his moment of glory at the restaurant, and then promptly gets the tummy ache of the century and pukes his guts up when he gets home. Hilarious. Heartfelt. Snarky. All of these things and more. And all at once. Done consistently. And done well. Perfect balance. Perfect show. Well, okay, no, it's not a perfect show. There are actually quite a few things that I think this show doesn't do great, or even does totally wrong. One glaring example is the entire character of Khan. While I think Khan can be a fun character, I think it kind of goes without saying that in the contemporary context, it is a little, problematic that his character is voiced like that and acts like that. Especially on American television, where Laotian performers and characters are kind of hard to come by. And there are plenty of other flaws and criticisms that I could get into, but that's not what this video is about. For all its flaws, it's a genuinely great show. So, what does this all mean exactly? Well, King of the Hill is a great show, duh. But when all these pieces that I've just dissected are looked at individually, what exactly does it say about the show as a whole? Well, it says a whole lot of things, really, and I'm not sure I can name all of them in the space of this one little analysis video, but I'm going to try and condense it down to this. It's not just one thing. It's complex. It's layered. The characters contain multitudes. The perspective changes constantly. There are no teams or loyalties, just fleshed out characters in fun situations. In this sense, it's super real, while also being really silly when it needs to be. It's more than comedy. It transcends just that. It's a full-bodied story. Very humble, I know. Hard to grasp. But that's what all of this really boils down to. Through strong characters, a thorough world rooted in our own experiences, and an equilibrium of humor and heart, we get more than a sitcom. We get a world we can believe is real, and feel attached to, and laugh at.
You have been kicked in the testicles. Oh!
There's so much more to say. I could go on, but I'm not the Funkland, I'm not gonna keep you. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope to tackle more things I like in the future. Maybe I'll come back to this. Who knows? I have a lot to say about King of the Hill. See you guys around, and stay away from charcoal.